In the winter of 1886, a grieving rancher hired a housekeeper to cook his meals and scrub his floors. What he got instead was a woman who refused to let his family disappear into silence. What she got was a household full of broken people who didn't know how to ask for help. Neither of them planned to fall in love. Neither of them planned a lot of things. But somewhere between the first frost and the last snowmelt, something shifted. Quietly, stubbornly, the way real things always do. Stay until the end. Like the video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind off the mountain came down hard that November morning. The kind that didn't just cut through a coat, but seemed to reach in and find whatever soft thing a person was still carrying. Evelyn Mercer felt it the moment she stepped down from the wagon, her boots landing on ground that was half frozen mud, half gravel, and entirely unforgiving. She steadied herself with one hand on the wagon board, took in the ranch before her, and decided not to let her face do anything her mind hadn't already prepared for. It was worse than the letter described. Not in any way she could point to specifically. The main house still stood, the barn looked functional, the fencing along the eastern pasture was rough but intact. It was worse in the way that places get when people have stopped caring about them the way they once did. A shutter on the left window hung at an angle that somebody had meant to fix for a long time. The front step had a crack running diagonal from corner to corner. Wood was stacked against the south wall of the house, but it had been stacked in a hurry, carelessly, and the pile had already begun to lean. Everything on the property looked like a man who'd gotten up, gotten dressed, and kept moving, but had stopped actually looking at himself years ago. "You Evelyn Mercer?" She turned. A man had come around the corner of the barn without her hearing him, which told her something about the noise the wind was making and something else about him. He was taller than she'd expected from a man who described himself in a letter as a rancher of modest means, though she supposed height had nothing to do with modesty. He wore a canvas coat that had seen better decades, and his hat was pulled low enough that she had to wait a beat before she could read his face clearly. She read it. Then she put it away somewhere in her mind to examine later. "That's right," she said. "And you're Silas Rowan." "I am." He didn't move to take her bag. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to price correctly. Not rude, not warm, just assessing. "You're younger than I figured." "You're older," she replied. Something crossed his face. She couldn't tell if it was irritation or something that might eventually become amusement if given enough time and the right conditions. He turned without another word and walked toward the house, and she took that as her invitation to follow. The inside of the house was clean enough to suggest someone had made an effort recently, but it had the particular staleness of a place cleaned out of necessity rather than comfort. The furniture was solid, good Wyoming pine, built to last, but the surfaces held the faint grayness of wood that hadn't been properly oiled in years. There was a stone fireplace along the north wall with a decent fire going, and two boys sat at the kitchen table doing what looked like absolutely nothing, which Evelyn recognized immediately as the specific kind of nothing that happens when children have been told to sit down and behave for someone's arrival. The older one was maybe 12. Dark-haired like his father, with the same quality of stillness, like a pond that was deeper than it looked. He watched her come through the door with eyes that had already made up their mind about something. The younger one was 7, maybe 8. He had a piece of string wound around his fingers that he kept worrying at, over and under, without looking down. His hair needed cutting badly. He did look up briefly, with the particular hope of a child who is still young enough to keep hoping, then looked back down at his string. "Boys," Silas said, not stopping as he moved toward the kitchen. "This is Miss Mercer. She's going to be helping out around the house." "Hello?" said the younger one. His voice was small and careful. The older one said nothing. Evelyn set her bag down just inside the door. "What are your names?" Silas answered from the kitchen. "Older one's Thomas. Younger is Henry." "I'd rather they told me themselves," Evelyn said. A pause from the kitchen. She kept her eyes on the boys. The younger one, Henry, looked up again. "I'm Henry," he said, as though confirming something he'd needed permission to say. Thomas continued his silence for another 3 seconds. She counted, then said, "Thomas," in the flat, deliberate tone of someone doing something against his better judgment. "Good," Evelyn said. "Thank you." She picked up her bag and looked at Silas when he came back around from the kitchen. "Where am I sleeping?" The room he showed her was small, which she expected, but it had a window that faced east, which she hadn't. Morning light. That mattered to her more than the size, more than the narrow cot with its patched quilt, more than the single hook on the wall for hanging her things. She set her bag on the cot and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the eastern ridge, at the way the sky was going pale gold above it in the thin afternoon light. She had $12 to her name. She had the clothes in her bag, a pair of good scissors, a Bible she hadn't opened since her mother died, and a recipe box made of cedar. She had 30 months of experience keeping house for a family in Cheyenne, whose patriarch had eventually decided he wanted a wife, not an employee, and had communicated this in a way that made leaving immediately the only reasonable option. She had before that 3 years in a laundry in Laramie that had taught her everything about work and almost nothing about dignity. She was 29 years old. She was not fragile. She was not, anymore, particularly optimistic. But she was practical, and practical people play what they're dealt. She unpacked her bag, hung her 2 spare dresses on the hook, put the recipe box on the windowsill where she could see it, and went back out to assess the kitchen. The kitchen told her more than any introduction could have. There were 4 plates in the cupboard, 3 of them chipped, 2 cast iron skillets, 1 well-seasoned, 1 that had been scrubbed raw and would need attention. Dry goods in the pantry were organized in a way that suggested they'd been arranged once with care and then replenished without bothering to maintain any system. She found cornmeal behind the vinegar, flour in a sack that had been tied shut with a piece of fence wire, salt in 2 different locations as though it had been purchased twice out of uncertainty. There was salt pork and dried beans, potatoes going soft in a bin, a rope of onions hanging from a nail, and 3 eggs in a bowl on the counter that she hoped were recent. There was also a pot of something on the stove that had gone past edible sometime before her arrival. She moved it off the heat without comment. Silas came in while she was taking inventory. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed in a way that she suspected was habitual rather than confrontational. "Supper's usually around 6, he said. "What have you been eating?" "Salt pork, beans. Every night?" "Mostly." A pause. "Boys don't complain." She turned to look at him. "Boys that age don't complain about food because they don't know they're allowed to. Doesn't mean they're not tired of it." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Mercer, I hired you to keep house, not to tell me about my boys." "You hired me to keep house," she said, turning back to the pantry. "I'm assessing the house. This is what that looks like." He stood there another moment. She didn't turn around again. Eventually, she heard him push off the doorframe and walk away, and she let out a breath she'd been holding carefully. That was the first hour. She made biscuits that evening because biscuits required nothing more than what was already there, and because biscuits, done correctly, are their own argument. She fried salt pork. She wasn't a miracle worker, and there wasn't time to do much else. But she made a proper gravy from the drippings, added onion, let it go low and slow while the biscuits baked, and put it all on the table at 6 minutes past 6. She'd found a jar of preserved plums in the back of the pantry, dusty but sealed, and opened it. She didn't know who'd put them up. She didn't ask. The boys appeared at the table with their father. Thomas sat in the same chair as before. Henry took the chair closest to the window. Silas sat at the head of the table in a chair that was slightly different from the others. Heavier, older, clearly his. There was a 4th chair pushed slightly back from the table that no one sat in. Evelyn noted it. She sat in the chair nearest the kitchen, which required her to pull it out from where it was tucked against the wall. No one said grace. No one said anything at first. Silas served the boys, which surprised her a little, and then helped himself. He bit into a biscuit, and she watched his expression do something careful and neutral that she recognized as a man trying not to show that something was better than he expected. Henry ate with the focused seriousness of a child who'd learned to appreciate food at a deep level. After his second biscuit, he looked up. "These are good," he said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Thomas said nothing, but he ate 2.5 biscuits and all of his gravy and went back for more plums when he thought no one was watching. She was watching. She didn't say anything about it. The first week established the shape of things. Silas was up before light and out the door most mornings before she'd finished stoking the stove. He ran cattle, a modest herd between 200 and 300 head, she gathered from what she overheard. across land that stretched north and west of the house toward the base of the mountains. He had one hired hand, a taciturn Swede named Anders, who appeared at meals sometimes and disappeared again without much ceremony. There were horses to manage, fencing to maintain, the ongoing grinding administration of a working cattle operation going into winter. Silas worked the way some men pray, with a single-minded exhaustion that left no room for anything else. The boys were in school 3 days a week in the nearest town, 5 miles east. They walked when weather allowed, rode when it didn't. On the other days, they had chores and a loose arrangement of lessons that Evelyn quickly understood had been aspirational rather than actual for some time. Henry was bright and eager in the sideways manner of a child who'd learned to hide how much he wanted things. He'd show up in the kitchen while she worked and not say anything for a while, just orbiting, until eventually something came out. A question about what she was cooking, or a statement about something he'd seen outside, delivered to the middle distance rather than directly to her. She answered everything he offered without making too much of it, and he kept coming back. Thomas was harder. He was not cruel. She'd been braced for cruelty and didn't find it. What she found instead was a careful, sealed-off quality. A 12-year-old who had made a decision somewhere along the way that investing in people was a losing proposition. He did what was asked of him, maintained a polite enough surface, and kept his distance like it was a point of principle. She didn't push him. She'd been 12 once. She knew what it cost to be that age, and that defended. The first real difficulty came on a Thursday in the second week. She'd been washing the windows. The grime on them was layered enough that she'd been working one pane at a time all week. When she heard the argument start in the barn, male voices, both of them, and it took her a moment to realize that one of the voices was too high to be Silas and too controlled to be Henry. Thomas. She couldn't hear the words, only the shape of them. Thomas's voice with that particular quality of someone who has decided to stop being reasonable, and Silas's voice going low and hard in response. She kept her rag moving on the glass and told herself it wasn't her business. Then she heard the word mama cut out of Thomas's voice like something thrown, and then silence. She put the rag down. She didn't go to the barn. She went to the kitchen instead and put water on for the coffee. Silas never had time to make himself in the afternoons. And then she found the small bag of dried apple slices she'd been saving and put them in a pan with a little sugar and water and let them go soft on low heat. 20 minutes later, Thomas came in through the back door. His face was the specific blank of someone who'd been crying and had gotten themselves under control through sheer will. He was 12 years old and he looked about 40. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "Sit down if you want," she said, not looking at him. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't say anything about hungry." He stood there. She stirred the apples. The kitchen smelled warm. He sat down. She set a small bowl of the cooked apples in front of him and poured 2 cups of coffee, put one in front of him. He was 12 and she wasn't his mother, and he could have coffee if he wanted it, and sat down across the table. He looked at the bowl. He looked at the coffee. He didn't say anything. "You don't have to tell me anything," Evelyn said. "You don't know me well enough for that, and that's fine." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He doesn't talk about her," he said finally. "Ever. I just asked him something about her, and he acted like He stopped. "Like I'd done something wrong." "What did you ask him?" Thomas looked at the table. "Whether she would have liked the first snow. She used to love the first snow. I just wanted to know if he remembered that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I don't know your father well enough to speak for him," she said carefully. "But some people, when something hurts bad enough, they can't step near it at all. Even talking about it feels like it might pull them under." Thomas looked up. His eyes were still raw at the edges. "So he just never talks about her forever?" "I don't know," she said honestly. I can't tell you that." "That's not a very good answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He ate some of the apples. They sat there in the warm kitchen while the wind picked up outside, and she refilled his cup even though he'd barely drunk any, and he let her. He didn't thank her when he left, but he came back to the kitchen for supper without being called, and when she handed him his plate, he said, "Thank you, Miss Mercer," with the particular formality of a boy trying very hard to be something. "Evelyn's all right," she said. He thought about it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. which wasn't quite agreement but wasn't refusal either. Silas came in late that night, later than usual. She'd left a plate for him on the back of the stove and a lamp burning low on the kitchen table, which was the extent of what she considered appropriate. She was in her room when she heard him come through, heard the particular quiet of a man moving around a house full of sleeping people. She heard him stop. She thought later that he'd probably stood there looking at the plate she'd left in the lamp, and that something in the ordinary care of it had perhaps hit him strangely. She didn't know. She only heard the silence and then the quiet sounds of him sitting down and eating, and then silence again, and then his boots on the floorboards going toward his room. She lay in the dark with the east window showing her a thin slice of night sky and thought about the fourth chair pushed back from the table, and about a boy who only wanted to know if his mother would have loved the first snow. By the third week, she had the kitchen running properly. This was not a small thing. A kitchen is the lungs of a house. It sets the rhythm, the warmth, the smell of things. She reorganized the pantry, got the scrubbed raw skillet back to seasoning, found that the oven ran hot on the left side and adjusted accordingly. She started a pot of beans every 2 days instead of when they ran out. She made bread on Mondays and Thursdays. She kept the coffee pot in a reliable state. Silas noticed, in the way people notice things they'd planned not to, with a kind of reluctant acknowledgement, a small shift in bearing. He started coming in to breakfast earlier. Not to talk, he still didn't talk much in the mornings. But he was there, with his coffee, at the table, before the boys came down, and she understood this as something. Henry had started bringing her things. Interesting rocks initially. He had a collector's impulse and no organized system for it, which meant rocks appeared on various surfaces throughout the house in a way that could have been maddening, but wasn't. Then he brought her a drawing. It was of a horse. It was actually quite good. She held it and looked at it for what was probably longer than necessary. "Did you draw this?" she asked. He was watching her from the doorway with the particular anxiety of a child waiting for a verdict on something that mattered too much. "Yes, ma'am." "When?" "This morning. Before school." He shifted his weight. "It's not that good." "Henry," she said, "this is very good." He looked immediately suspicious of this. "Papa says drawing's not useful." She set the picture down on the counter where she could see it while she worked. "Your papa knows a great deal about cattle," she said. "He knows somewhat less about everything else." From somewhere behind her she heard a sound that might have been Thomas swallowing a laugh. She pinned the drawing up above the kitchen window with 2 small tacks she found in a tin in the utility drawer. Henry stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute after that, looking at the picture on the wall with an expression she didn't know how to name exactly. It was the expression of someone watching something they'd made exist in the world in a way it hadn't before. The incident with the fence happened in the 4th week, and it changed the shape of things again. Silas had gone out with Anders on Monday morning to move a portion of the herd to the south pasture before the next cold front came through. He'd said he'd be back by dark. He wasn't back by dark. He wasn't back by 8. By 9, the boys were in bed, and Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp up and the coffee hot, listening to the wind and deciding every 10 minutes not to be worried. At 9:30, she heard the horse in the yard and then the barn door, and then nothing for long enough that she put her coat on and went out. He was in the barn, standing with his back to the door, one hand on the stall rail, and his left arm held at an angle she didn't like. "What happened?" she said from the doorway. He turned. In the lamplight she could see that his face had the gray, tight quality of someone managing pain carefully. "Fence wire," he said. "Nothing serious." "Let me see it." "Miss Mercer?" "Silas." She said it flat and direct and waited. He held out his arm. The gash ran from just below his elbow to his wrist, not deep enough for serious danger, but deep enough that it had bled significantly and was still seeping. He'd wrapped it in what looked like his bandana, which was now dark and soaked through. "You need stitches," she said. "I need to get the horses settled." "I'll get the horses settled. You need to go sit in the kitchen." He looked at her. "You know how to settle horses?" "I grew up on a horse farm in Nebraska," she said. "Go inside." She said it without drama, without softness, just as simple fact, and he went, which surprised her enough that she stood there for a moment before turning to deal with the horses. She settled both horses, which took her about 15 minutes. She was not as fast as she'd been at 17, but the knowledge hadn't gone anywhere. She came back inside to find Silas sitting at the kitchen table with his coat off and his arm on the table, and the lamp pulled close, and an expression on his face that was somewhere between pain and the particular discomfort of a man sitting still when he'd prefer to be in motion. She washed her hands. She found the needle and thread in her sewing box. She boiled water and found the iodine on the shelf in the utility room and brought everything to the table and sat down across from him. "This is gonna hurt," she said. "I figured. Do you want something to bite down on?" Something moved across his face. Not quite humor, not quite offense. "No," he said. She worked cleanly and efficiently. He made no sound except one sharp exhale near the middle when she had to pull the gash edges together more firmly. His hand, she noticed, was very large and very rough, and stayed entirely still on the table despite what she was doing to the arm attached to it. When she finished, she tied off the thread, bandaged the arm with clean cloth, and pushed back from the table. "Thank you," he said. His voice was careful. "You didn't have to. You were injured and needed help," she said. "That's not unusual in a household." He was quiet for a moment. She got up to put the kettle back on. "Where in Nebraska?" he said. She looked at him. "Pardon? You said you grew up on a horse farm in Nebraska." "Oh." She hadn't expected him to ask. "Outside of Kearney. Small place. My father ran about 40 head. Why'd you leave?" She got 2 cups out of the cupboard. "My father died," she said. "Farm went to his brother. That's usually how it goes." He didn't say he was sorry, which she appreciated. People saying they were sorry about things they had nothing to do with had always seemed strange to her. "How long ago?" he asked instead. 7 years. She poured the water. "I've been keeping house since then, in various places." "Wyoming long?" 2 years. She brought the cups to the table and sat back down. "I was in Laramie before this." He looked at the cup, then at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He considered this. "Someone older, more—" He seemed to run out of words and took a drink of coffee instead. "More what?" she said. "I don't know. More settled, maybe." "I'm plenty settled," she said. "I just haven't been in one place long enough for it to show." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had begun to recognize. It was the expression Silas Rowan wore when something had gone differently than he'd anticipated, and he wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The kitchen was warm, and the wind was loud outside, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was, she thought, its own kind of conversation. In the morning, Thomas came down to find her already at the stove and asked, with the careful indirection of someone pretending the question wasn't loaded, how his father's arm was. 7 stitches, she said. "He'll be fine. Don't let him carry anything heavy today if you can manage it." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "He let you stitch it?" He wasn't thrilled about it. "He doesn't usually—" Thomas stopped. Started again. "He doesn't usually let anyone help him with anything." She turned the biscuits. "I noticed." Henry appeared in the doorway in his socks, his hair going 3 directions. "Is Papa hurt?" "He cut his arm on the fence," she said. "He's all right." Henry appeared to process this. "You fixed it." "I did." Henry thought about it some more. "Good," he said finally, with the decisive simplicity of a child who has worked something out. He went back to put his boots on. Thomas was still standing there. He had a look on his face that she couldn't entirely read, something working itself through, some kind of recalculation happening just below the surface. "The fence on the south line needs the posts replaced," he said. "Papa knows, but there's been too much else." He was looking at the floor. "I thought you should know in case he tries to fix it himself when his arm is like this." She understood what she was being given. "I'll keep an eye on it," she said. He nodded. He picked up his coat from the chair by the door. "Biscuits smell good," he said, to no one in particular, and went out. October went, and November came down off the mountains in earnest. The days shortened, and the work didn't. She banked the fires at night and stoked them again before light, and kept the pantry stocked with what the weather would allow, and learned the rhythm of a working ranch the way you learn any complicated system, by making mistakes and fixing them without much ceremony. She made one real mistake in November, with the preserves. She'd found a batch of last summer's canning, tomatoes, green beans, a few jars of what turned out to be apple butter, in the root cellar when she'd gone down to bring up potatoes. She'd brought them up and used them through the week without asking, and on Thursday at supper, Silas looked at the apple butter on the table with an expression she didn't understand until later. She understood it that night when Henry, settling in beside her at the kitchen table while she worked on mending, told her that his mother had made apple butter every August. "Those were hers," he said simply. "She made them before the summer she got sick." Evelyn kept her needle moving for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "I know," Henry said. "We probably should have said." "Good." She set the mending down. "I'm sorry, Henry. I should have asked about what was down there before I just took it." He shrugged with the particular maturity of a child who had gotten very good at being gracious about things that hurt. "It's okay," he said. "Mama would have wanted them eaten. She hated waste." She looked at him. 8 years old, his father's coloring, but something softer in the face, his string still wrapped around his fingers in new configurations. "She sounds like she was a sensible woman," Evelyn said. Henry smiled. A real smile, quick and sudden, the kind that hadn't been practiced or prepared. "She was really funny," he said. "Nobody ever says that. They always say she was kind and good and beautiful and everything, but she was really funny. She used to make Thomas laugh so hard he stopped. He doesn't laugh like that anymore." Evelyn looked at the mending in her lap. "That kind of funny takes a long time to find again," she said quietly. "It doesn't mean it's gone." Henry looked at his string. "Do you think she can see us?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that the people we love stay with us in ways we don't always have words for. I think that's true." It wasn't a complete answer. She didn't have a complete answer. Henry seemed to understand this because he just nodded quietly and went back to his string. She sat in the kitchen with him for another hour, the lamp between them, the mending in her lap, the wind working at the window glass, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was somewhere she was supposed to be, even if she couldn't say exactly why. She found Silas in the barn on a Sunday in late November, not working, which was unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the workbench near the south wall with his back to her, and in his hands was something she couldn't see. He wasn't doing anything with it, just holding it. She would have backed out quietly, but he heard her. She'd learned by now that he always heard her. He was the kind of man who was perpetually listening to his surroundings, and turned. In his hands was a bridle, old and dark with use, with hand-tooled leatherwork along the cheek pieces, the kind of bridle that didn't happen by accident. "It was hers," he said, before she could say anything or pretend she hadn't seen. "It's beautiful work," she said. He looked back at it. She learned from her father, spent 2 years getting that pattern right. His voice was factual, careful. "I keep meaning to clean it properly, keep not doing it." She stayed in the doorway. She understood something about the space he needed. "Thomas asked me about her," he said. "Not with accusation, just as information. Couple weeks back, I didn't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to talk about her," he said, finally, in the voice of a man admitting something he's been unwilling to admit. "I don't know how to do that without it going somewhere I can't come back from easy." "I know," she said. "You don't know," he said, but not unkindly. "No," she agreed. "I don't. Not that specific thing." She paused. "But Thomas needs to talk about her. He needs to tell someone she was real." Silas was quiet. "He knows she was real," he said. "Knowing it in yourself and being allowed to say it out loud are different things," Evelyn said. "He needs you to say her name sometimes, that's all." A long silence. The horses moved in their stalls. The barn creaked. "Her name was Clara," he said. He said it like something being carefully set down after being carried too long. "Clara," Evelyn said. He nodded once. He put the bridle carefully back on its hook on the wall and ran his hand along the tooled leather once, briefly, and then turned and came toward the door. She stepped aside to let him out. He paused beside her. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said to Thomas. After the argument." He didn't look at her. "He told me. Eventually." "He's a good boy," she said. "He's better than I've managed to show him," Silas said, and walked toward the house. She stood in the barn doorway and let the cold air come in, and looked at the bridle on the wall, and thought about a woman named Clara who learned tooling from her father and made apple butter every August, and was, apparently, really funny. She thought about the fourth chair. She went back inside and made supper. December came hard. 3 feet of snow in the first week, which transformed the landscape into something that would have been beautiful if beauty hadn't been so exhausting to maintain shelter against. Silas and Anders worked the cattle through drifts. The boys were kept home from school for 10 days running. The house was small and close and full of people who had not previously spent that much continuous time together. It was instructive. Henry, deprived of school and outdoor range, turned to drawing with an intensity that bordered on compulsive. By the end of the first week, she had given him every scrap of paper she could find that wasn't needed for anything else, and he had filled it. He drew horses, cattle, the barn, the mountain ridge, a creditable likeness of Anders that she had to work to keep from laughing at when Henry showed it to her with the serious face of a professional artist seeking feedback. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think Anders's nose is slightly larger in real life," she said. Henry looked at it critically. "I was trying to be polite." "Artistic integrity is more important than politeness," she said. "In art." He went back and made the nose larger. He showed her the revision. She thought he'd gotten Anders's particular expression of long-suffering Scandinavian endurance exactly right, and told him so. Thomas spent the first 3 days of the enforced indoors in a state of barely contained restlessness that expressed itself as a kind of controlled damage. Moving furniture that didn't need moving, splitting wood in quantities beyond what the situation required, disappearing to the barn for hours on specific and slightly invented errands. She left him largely alone, made sure food appeared reliably, and didn't remark on the 4 cords of wood that appeared against the south wall. On the 4th day, she asked him if he could read. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked a stupid question and is deciding whether to be offended. "Of course I can read." "Can you read well? Out loud?" "I suppose." She had 3 books in her bag. She'd had more once, but she'd learned to travel light. She had a copy of Gulliver's Travels that she'd read twice, and a collection of short stories and a book on botany she'd bought in Laramie on an optimistic afternoon. She gave Thomas the short stories. "Read to Henry," she said. Thomas looked at the book. "He's not a baby. He can read himself." "Reading to someone is different from reading to yourself," she said. "It's a skill worth having." Thomas looked at the book. He looked at his brother, who was currently drawing something with his tongue between his teeth. He looked back at the book. "Fine," he said, in the tone of a person who was not going to admit he was curious about the book. She listened from the kitchen that afternoon to Thomas's voice. Careful at first, a little stiff, the cadence of someone who was reading and performing simultaneously. And then, gradually, warming into it as the story caught him, the pace steadying, and at one point a genuine laugh when the story went somewhere unexpected, which brought Henry's voice in bright and asking a question, and Thomas's voice going into explanation with the authority of someone who'd gotten there first. She stood at the kitchen counter and listened and didn't let her face do anything that might jinx it. That evening at supper, Thomas said, entirely unprompted, "The trick to the second story is the ending. You don't see it until you go back." Silas looked at him with an expression of quiet surprise. "What second story?" Henry said. "In the book Miss Mercer lent me." He seemed to realize something. "Evelyn," he corrected himself in the same careful tone he'd used before. "Not a surrender, exactly. An allowance." Silas looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the table, rearranging her fork. "What's it about?" Silas asked Thomas. And Thomas started talking, really talking, the way 12-year-olds talk when they found something that matters, with his hands involved and his voice going faster, and Henry asking questions, and Silas listening with his elbows on the table and his coffee forgotten going cold. She ate her supper and did not make anything of it, and the snow came down outside, and the fire was good, and all 4 of them were at the table together in the warm light. The 4th chair was occupied. She was sitting in it. By the end of December, the shape of things had changed in ways that were small and hard to point to, but unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at. Silas had started once in a while saying Clara's name. Not often, not easily, But Thomas had come in one evening from the barn to find his father at the kitchen table with Evelyn, and Silas had been saying something about the way Clara used to describe the first hard snow. Like the land pulling a blanket over its head, she said. And Thomas had stopped in the doorway, completely still, and something in his face that had been held shut for a long time had come, briefly, slightly, open. He'd sat down. He hadn't been invited, and he hadn't asked. He just sat down, and Silas had looked at him, and neither of them had said anything, and Evelyn had gotten up and gotten Thomas a cup of coffee and come back to her chair, and Silas had gone on. She used to say the ranch looked more honest under snow, like it stopped trying to impress anyone. Thomas had laughed. Small, surprised, a sound he didn't seem to have been expecting from himself. Silas had looked at his son with an expression that Evelyn was fairly sure contained, somewhere deep in it, gratitude. Though whether it was for the laugh itself or for the permission to keep going, she couldn't have said. She thought about that evening for a long time afterward. She was in a house full of grief and practicality and wind, employed as a housekeeper, present on a contract basis. She had no claim on any of it. She had wages and meals and a room with an east-facing window. She made herself remember that. She made herself remember it harder in the evenings when the kitchen was warm and the lamp was good, and Silas sat at the table longer than strictly necessary, not doing much of anything, just present. He was a difficult man to read. She had gotten better at it. He was not cold. She'd decided that weeks ago. He was careful. There was a difference. Cold people don't feel things. Careful people feel things too much and have learned to stand sideways to protect the feeling from the weather. She recognized it because she did the same thing. January came, the snow stayed, the ranch contracted around itself against the cold, and the four of them lived together in the warm middle of it, and Evelyn Mercer made biscuits on Monday and Thursday, kept the coffee in a reliable state, stitched where things needed stitching, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that for the first time in 7 years, she had somewhere she was not ready to leave. The conversation she had with Anders in the last week of January was brief and unremarkable, and stayed with her longer than conversations usually did. Anders had come in for his midday meal. He ate in the kitchen, not with the family, which was his choice, and she respected it. And she'd put his plate in front of him and gone back to her bread. He ate for a while in silence, which was normal. Then he said, without preamble, "He was bad before you came." She looked at him. Anders was a large man, somewhere in his late 50s, with the economical speaking habits of someone who had decided years ago that words were expensive. He ate another bite. Not mean bad, just, he thought about it, gone bad, like a lamp that's still on but nobody's home in the house. She went back to her bread. "He's a man who's been through hard things," she said. "He's been through hard things since Clara died," Anders said. "That's 4 years. Boys were growing up. He was there, but he wasn't. He ate. Different now." She didn't say anything. "Wanted you to know," he said, "since you probably don't." He finished his plate, brought it to the sink, and went back out. She stood at the counter for a moment after he left with her hands still in the bread dough, and looked at Henry's drawings tacked up above the kitchen window. There were 6 of them now, a whole small gallery of horses and landscapes, and one very accurate portrait of a barn cat, and thought about a lamp still on in an empty house, and about what it meant to come home to somewhere that felt inhabited again. She shaped her loaves and put them into rise, and didn't let herself think about it any more that afternoon. But she thought about it at night, with the east window showing her winter stars, for longer than was probably useful. February arrived without apology. The cold that month was the kind that settled into the bones of the house itself. The kind where you could feel the temperature difference between a room with a fire and a room without one the moment you stepped through the doorway, where the window panes held frost on the inside glass by morning and the water in the kitchen basin had a thin skim of ice before she got the stove going. Evelyn learned the house's particular vulnerabilities the way you learn a person's. The north corner of the boys' room, where the wind found a gap in the chinking, the kitchen door that had to be lifted slightly while pulling or it wouldn't seal, the place on the main room floor that went genuinely cold unless you put a rug over it. She fixed what she could fix. She worked around what she couldn't. Silas said nothing about any of this, which she had learned was his version of approval. The boys had started sitting with her in the evenings more consistently now, not by any announced arrangement, just by accumulation. Henry would bring his drawings. Thomas would bring whatever book she'd last given him and read it in the lamplight with the occasional observation delivered to no one specific, testing the air for response the way you test a frozen pond by pressing one foot down before committing your weight. Silas came in later, usually after the boys were nearly ready for bed, and sat with his coffee in the chair he'd claimed without ceremony as his, the one angled slightly toward the fire, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. It was a life. A specific, bounded, borrowed life. She knew that. She was employed here. She kept reminding herself of the shape of the thing. She didn't always succeed. The trouble with February was that it was long and close quarters have a way of wearing down the careful distances people keep between themselves. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in the kinds of stories people tell where everything changes in a single moment. It happened the way erosion happens. Gradually, then all at once, without any one event you could point to as the cause. Thomas started talking to her the way he talked to people he'd decided to trust, which was different in texture from his previous careful politeness. The difference was that he stopped choosing his words for safeness and started choosing them for accuracy. He said one evening, while she was working on a tear in his coat sleeve, and he was nominally reading, "I think Anders is lonelier than he lets on." She kept her needle moving. "What makes you say that?" "He talks to the horses," Thomas said. "Not like work talk, like conversation. Plenty of people talk to animals. He asks them questions," Thomas said, "and then waits, like he actually thinks they might answer." She bit off her thread and examined the seam. "That's not the worst way to be," she said. Thomas considered this. He turned a page. "Do you get lonely?" he asked, with the directness of someone who has decided the question is worth the discomfort. She looked at him. He was looking at his book, which told her how much the question had cost him. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Less than I used to." He didn't ask what had changed. He went back to reading. But the question sat between them in a way that was neither uncomfortable nor fully resolved, just present, the way real things are. Silas, the following week, did something she hadn't expected. He came in at midday. Unusual for him. He almost never came in before supper, and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was making bread and said, "I'm going into town Friday. Need anything from the store?" She turned, surprised. "I can make a list." "Do that," he said. He didn't leave. He stood there another moment. "Boys are at school. You could come along if you wanted." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall behind her with the expression of someone who has said something and isn't sure now how it sounded. "All right," she said. He nodded once and went back out. She turned back to her bread and did not make anything of it, and made the list. And on Friday they rode to town together in the wagon, in a companionable enough silence, broken by occasional practical exchanges about road conditions and what the store was likely to be out of this time of year. And it was not remarkable in any way that she could explain to anyone, and she thought about it for 3 days afterward. The town was called Harlow. It had a general store, a livery, a feed, and grain, a saloon she'd never had occasion to enter, and a small cluster of houses that gave way quickly to open country on all sides, as though the town itself wasn't certain of its own permanence. She'd been twice before, both times for specific supply runs. She knew the storekeeper slightly, a man named Greer, who had the pleasant, alert manner of someone who gathered information the way other people gathered would against future need. Greer saw them come in together, and his expression did something subtle and carefully neutral. She pretended not to notice. She went through the list while Silas loaded the heavier supplies into the wagon. At the counter, while Greer was wrapping the smaller items, a woman came in who greeted Silas by name with the warmth of long acquaintance, and then turned to Evelyn with the bright, assessing gaze of someone doing a rapid and comprehensive calculation. "You must be the woman out at the Rowan place," she said. "Evelyn Mercer," Evelyn said. "Ruth Calloway." The handshake was firm and businesslike. "I've heard good things. From the boys, mostly, when they come through school. Henry says you put his drawings on the wall." "They're good drawings," Evelyn said. Ruth Calloway was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had settled into its expressions over a long time and felt honest for it. She looked at Evelyn the way women sometimes look at other women when they're trying to decide if they're on the same side. "Those boys needed something steady," she said, lower, while Silas was occupied with the loading. "They've been—" She stopped. "Well, you can probably see." I can see, Evelyn said. Ruth nodded. Something seemed to satisfy her. You need anything in town? Anything at all? You come find me, she said. I'm in the house at the east end of the main road. Green door. Evelyn thanked her. Silas came back and they finished loading and drove back out under a sky the color of pewter that was thinking about snow. Halfway home, Silas said, without particular preamble, Ruth Calloway is a good woman. Her husband died 3 years back. She runs the school board and half of everything else in town and pretends she doesn't. She seemed capable, Evelyn said. She checked you over pretty thoroughly. I noticed. He drove. Did she say anything? She told me to come to her if I needed anything. He was quiet. Good, he said finally. Another half mile. The first snow started, light and unhurried. She checked everyone over, he said. The first year, after Clara, every woman who came within range. He said it without bitterness, just as information. I think she was trying to make sure no one took advantage of the situation. Evelyn watched the snow coming down on the road ahead. That's a kind thing to do for someone. She's a kind woman, he said. Doesn't always look like it. She thought about this and about the careful way he'd said Clara's name without her prompting him, the way it had started coming easier in the last few weeks, still with weight but without quite the same bracing quality, like a door that had been stuck and was starting to move on its hinges again. She didn't remark on it. She just sat beside him in the wagon with the snow coming down around them and let it be what it was. The incident that changed things with Thomas came without warning in the 3rd week of February, the way the things that actually matter usually do. She was in the root cellar taking stock of the winter supplies. They were in better shape than she'd feared. The potatoes had kept well, and there were enough preserved goods to get comfortably through to thaw when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not the kind of raised voices that meant an argument, the kind that meant something had gone wrong. She came up the cellar steps to find Thomas standing in the yard with his hand pressed flat against his side and a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be panic. Anders was beside him, saying something in the rapid, low, Swedish-accented English he used when he was concerned. What happened? She said, crossing the yard. The rope on the pulley got wrapped wrong, Anders said. Came back, caught him. Let me see, she said to Thomas. I'm fine, he said, in exactly the tone of his father. Thomas. He lifted his hand. The rope had caught him across the ribs, and the force had been enough that when she pressed carefully along the side, he exhaled sharply and his jaw locked. Can you breathe all the way? She asked. He demonstrated, short, careful. Come inside, she said. Anders is a grown man, she said. Come inside. She got him onto the kitchen bench and examined the damage. Bruised ribs at minimum, possibly one cracked, but his breathing was consistent enough that she didn't think anything worse. She wrapped him firmly with strips of clean cloth from the mending box, talking him through it, and he sat very still and tolerated the process with the rigid dignity of a 12-year-old who was not going to be caught crying in the kitchen. He came close, once, when she tightened the wrap. His eyes went bright, and he looked at the window hard. Almost done, she said quietly. You're doing fine. He swallowed. I should have checked the rope. Probably, she said, and next time you will. That's how you learn things without someone having to teach them. That's a strange way to put it. Is it wrong? He thought about it, which meant he'd stopped thinking about his ribs for a moment. No, he said. She tied off the wrap and stepped back. He sat on the bench looking somewhat diminished, which was not a look Thomas Rowan wore comfortably. He was the kind of boy who carried himself like he'd already decided to be equal to whatever came, and having something knock him sideways sat badly. You'll need to take it easy for a few days, she said. I can't. There's Thomas. She said it with the same flat directness she'd used on his father the night of the fence wire, and he stopped. Your ribs need time. The work will wait. He looked at his hands. Papa's going to... Your father will understand, she said. He's had cracked ribs himself, probably more than once. Something in Thomas's face shifted. He told you that? He didn't have to, she said. It's a working ranch. He was quiet for a moment. Then, at a somewhat different angle, like a question he'd been holding for a while and had decided now was as good a time as any. Do you like it here? She looked at him. He was looking at his hands. Yes, she said. I do. even though it's... He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, meaning the house, the ranch, the whole frozen, difficult, grief-stained arrangement. All of this is worth liking, she said, the hard parts included. He looked up at her. He had his father's eyes, that quality of depth, of more going on underneath than showed on the surface. You're not like what I thought a housekeeper would be, he said. What did you think? I don't know. He almost smiled. More like someone's grandmother. I'm 29, she said. I know. The almost smile settled into something more real. That's why it's different. She went to put the kettle on. Your father is going to come in for lunch in about an hour, she said. You can tell him yourself what happened, or I can, or we can wait and see if Anders tells him first. Those are your options. He thought about this seriously, as he did most things. I'll tell him, he said. It's better coming from me. I think so too, she said. He told his father. It went about as these things go. Silas came in from outside with the look of someone who'd already been briefed by Anders and was making the effort not to show it, listened to Thomas's account with the serious attention of a man who respected the courage it took to tell your own bad news, and then asked a series of practical questions about the rope and the pulley that were really questions about what Thomas had learned, which Thomas answered with more composure than she expected. At the end, Silas put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Thomas looked at his father's hand and then at the table. All right, Silas said. He looked at Evelyn. Ribs? Bruised? Possibly one cracked on the left side, she said. He needs a few days off the heavy work. Silas nodded. Anders can manage. He poured himself coffee, sat down, looked at his son. You did right, checking the rope after, he said. You checked it, yes? Yes, sir, Thomas said. Good. That's what you do. He drank his coffee. Hurts like hell, doesn't it? Yes, sir, Thomas said, with feeling. Silas almost smiled. Drink something warm. Helps a little. Henry, who had come in from school in the middle of this exchange and had been standing in the doorway taking it all in with large eyes, said, I could draw you a picture to make it better. Thomas looked at his brother. Drawing doesn't make ribs better, Henry. It might, Henry said with perfect seriousness. You don't know. Despite everything, Thomas laughed. A real one, catching him off guard, which made him grab his side immediately and wince, which made Henry look guilty, which somehow made Thomas laugh again in a shorter, more careful way. Silas was watching his sons. Evelyn was at the stove, and she did not turn around, but she heard it. The quality of silence from Silas's direction that sometimes meant he was feeling something he hadn't prepared himself to feel. She kept her eyes on the stove. Some things you don't look directly at. March came in cold and went out muddy, which was the best you could hope for in Wyoming. The thaw was slow and grudging, the kind that gives you 3 warm days and then takes one back, advancing in small installments like a debt being paid off with difficulty. The ranch, freed gradually from snow, revealed itself again. The fence line that had needed repair since fall, the section of barn roof that had collected ice damage, the south pasture gate that had frozen solid and been forced open too many times and now hung wrong. Silas drove himself at the repair work the way he drove himself at everything, with a thoroughness that didn't leave room for much else. But the something that had shifted over winter was still shifted. He didn't retreat from the kitchen the way he had in November. He still didn't talk abundantly, but what he said had changed quality. It was less like a man maintaining necessary communication and more like a man who had remembered that other people were worth talking to. One evening in the middle of March, she was at the table going over the household accounts. She'd been keeping them since February at Silas's distracted request, which had turned out to mean organizing a system that had previously consisted of various pieces of paper in a tin box. When he came in and looked over her shoulder at what she was working on. You found the McAllister receipt, he said. I found several McAllister receipts, she said. 3 of them are duplicates. He charged me twice for the same nails last fall, Silas said. I meant to take it up with him. I noticed. I wrote it down so you wouldn't have to remember. He looked at the ledger she'd set up. Dates, amounts, categories, a running balance that made the household finances legible in a way they apparently hadn't been in some time. He was quiet for a moment. Claire used to do this, he said. He didn't say it with grief exactly, more with a kind of recognition. like finding a familiar path he'd lost track of. She was better at the numbers than I am. Most people are better at numbers than they think, Evelyn said. Not me, he said, without self-pity. I'm not. She knew that. She handled the books herself and just told me what I needed to know. He pulled the chair out across from her and sat down, which was unusual. He almost never sat at the table unless it was mealtime. I didn't look at the accounts for 6 months after she died, he said. Anders figured out I was running short and told me straight. That's when I knew it had gotten bad. That was honest of him, she said. He's a blunt man, Silas said. It's useful. She entered the last figure and closed the ledger. She could feel him still sitting there, not done with whatever he'd sat down to say or be near, and she didn't rush him. The boys are better, he said finally. This winter, compared to last. They're good boys, she said. They are. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Henry showed me the drawings you've been putting up. He said, he stopped, started differently. He said you told him artistic integrity matters more than politeness. He's been saying that to Thomas at regular intervals ever since. She kept her face even. Is that a problem? It's annoying, Thomas, he said, and the quality in his voice told her plainly that he found this entirely acceptable, possibly even satisfying. I'll take responsibility for that, she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face had a different quality than it did in daylight. More open somehow, the habitual guardedness less armored. You don't have to take responsibility for everything, he said. Some things are just... He seemed to weigh something. Good things that happen. She looked at him steadily. All right, she said. He nodded. He didn't get up. The lamp burned between them, and outside the window the March wind was doing something complicated with the bare branches of the cottonwood near the barn, and the house was quiet except for the low sounds of boys sleeping and fire settling. She thought, I am in serious trouble. She thought it clearly and without drama, the way you think the true thing when there's no one around to perform for. She was in serious trouble, and she had been for some time, and the only question left was what she was going to do about it, which was, she decided, nothing. She was employed here. She had wages and a room with an east window. She was going to be sensible and practical and keep the coffee in a reliable state and not make anything of a man sitting at her kitchen table at 9 p.m. because he hadn't wanted to go to bed yet. She was going to be very, very sensible. Silas finally pushed back from the table and stood. Good night, Evelyn, he said. Good night, she said. He went to his room. She sat at the table for another 10 minutes with the closed ledger in front of her, not doing anything in particular, and then she went to her room and lay in the dark looking at the east window and thought about a woman named Clara who had kept the accounts and known her husband couldn't do numbers and had built a life in this house that still had its shape in every room if you knew where to look. She was not Clara. She was not trying to be Clara. She was Evelyn Mercer, 29 years old, a housekeeper on a contract basis, in serious trouble and too practical to do anything about it. She fell asleep thinking about the fourth chair and the way Silas had said good things that happened as though he was only just now allowing himself to notice them. April came in green and exhausted, the way the land always looked after a hard Wyoming winter. Relieved to still be there, not yet ready to be beautiful about it. The pastures showed the first real color in months, pale and tentative, and the cattle moved differently in it, like animals remembering something they'd temporarily forgotten. Evelyn noticed all of this from the kitchen window while she worked, and she noticed that she noticed it, which told her something about how much the ranch had gotten into her in ways she hadn't planned for. She was practical about it. She kept being practical about it. She made the bread on Mondays and Thursdays, kept the accounts, managed the household with the steady competence that was the entire basis of her presence here, and tried to treat the feeling that had taken up residence in her chest like a difficult weather condition. Something to be acknowledged and then worked around. It didn't entirely cooperate. The problem was that spring changed the shape of things. Winter had been a forcing together. The cold and the snow and the early dark had pushed the four of them into the same warm spaces out of necessity, and there had been something protective in that, a logic to the closeness that didn't require examination. Spring removed that logic. The days got longer and the work moved outside, and Silas was gone from the house more hours than before, and the boys ranged further in the afternoons, and the particular intimacy of the winter kitchen gave way to something more open and therefore more exposed. She felt the exposure. She was not accustomed to feeling exposed. Thomas, now some weeks past his bruised ribs and back to full capacity, had developed the habit of stopping by the kitchen in the early mornings before his chores. Not for any stated reason, just appearing, pouring himself coffee with the casual authority of someone who had decided he was old enough, taking it to the back step and sitting there while the morning came in. She didn't comment on the coffee. On the third or fourth morning, she just started having a cup ready for him. One morning in early April, he said, from the back step where she could hear him through the open door, "Anders is teaching me the south fence line." "Good," she said. "You'll know it better than your father does in a year." A pause. "Papa knows it fine." "I know he does. I'm saying you'll know it even better because you're learning it on purpose instead of by accident." She could hear him thinking about this. That's a strange compliment. It's an accurate one. He drank his coffee. She could hear the morning birds doing their April business in the cottonwood. "Do you think he sees it?" Thomas said. "Papa, I mean, when things get better." She considered her answer. "I think he sees it when he lets himself," she said. "He's getting better at letting himself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Because of you," he said, in the flat, factual tone he used when he'd decided something was true and was going to say it regardless of whether it was comfortable. She moved away from the doorway slightly and said nothing. "I'm not trying to make it strange," he said. "I'm just saying what's true. Before you came, he was here, but he was—" A pause while he found the right word. "Sealed up," he said finally, "like a jar that nobody could get open anymore." She thought of what Anders had said in February, a lamp that's still on but nobody's home in the house. "He loves you and your brother very much," she said. "That was never the sealed up part." "I know," Thomas said. "But love that nobody can get to isn't very useful." She set her rag down on the counter. She looked at the drawings above the window. 8 of them now. Henry's quiet, ongoing record of everything he noticed. "No," she said. "It isn't." He finished his coffee and went to his chores. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the morning light and thought about sealed jars and the particular patience it took to wait for one to open on its own terms. The thing with Henry happened on a Saturday afternoon near the middle of April, and it was, like most things with Henry, both smaller and larger than it first appeared. He had taken to spending his Saturday afternoons in the barn with his drawing paper, not because of the barn specifically, but because the light came through the south-facing window. There at an angle he found useful, and because nobody bothered him, and because the horses were calming in the way that animals often are for children who feel things more than they can say. She knew this because she'd found him there twice, and both times he'd shown her what he was working on with the serious professional manner he brought to all his creative undertakings. That Saturday, she heard him from the barn before she saw him, which was unusual. Henry was generally quiet. The sound was not crying exactly, but was adjacent to it, the specific sound of a child trying very hard not to make any sound at all. She went to the barn. He was sitting in the south window light with his drawing things around him, and a piece of paper in his hands that he was holding in a way that suggested he'd been holding it for some time. His face was dry, but his eyes were the color that eyes go after they've been wet and then made to stop. On the paper was a drawing, a woman's face, carefully done, with the particular attention to detail that Henry brought to things he took seriously. It wasn't a perfect likeness. She didn't know if it was a likeness at all, but it was clearly done from a deep, concentrated kind of memory, the kind where you close your eyes and try to hold the image still before it shifts. She sat down on the hay bale beside him without saying anything. He didn't try to hide the drawing. He held it in his lap and looked at it. "I'm forgetting what she looked like," he said. The words were very quiet. She looked at the drawing. She didn't say it's okay because it wasn't okay. It was the specific, unbearable thing about losing someone when you're young, the way time does its work on the image without your permission. "You drew this from memory?" she said. "From trying to remember," he said. "It's not right. Her nose wasn't in—" He stopped. "I can't get the nose right." She sat with that for a moment. "Is there a photograph?" she asked. "Anywhere in the house?" He shook his head. "Papa had one. I don't know where it is now." She made a decision. "Come with me," she said. She took him to the barn's tack wall, to Claire's bridle. still hanging where Silas had put it back that November afternoon. She let Henry look at it for a moment, the careful tooled work along the cheek pieces, the hours in it. "Your mother made this?" she said. He reached out and touched it very carefully, with 2 fingers. "I know. The pattern she put in here. See the way it repeats? Your father told me she spent 2 years getting it exactly right." She paused. "That patience, that eye for detail. Henry, that's in you. The way you draw, the way you look at things. That doesn't come from nowhere." He looked at the bridle for a long time. Then he looked at his drawing. "I want to ask Papa about the photograph," he said, "but I don't want to make him—" He gestured, meaning the sealed-up quality, meaning the cost. "I'll come with you if you want," she said. He thought about it carefully, with the deliberate seriousness he brought to serious things. "No," he said finally. "I should ask him myself." He folded the drawing and put it in his shirt pocket. "But thank you." He went to find his father. She stayed in the barn for a few minutes with the afternoon light on the tooled leather and the horses shifting in their stalls, and then she went back to start supper. That evening, Silas came to the kitchen door while she was cooking and stood there in the way he had, leaning on the frame, not quite entering. His face had the particular look it sometimes got now, the one that meant something had moved in him, that he was still settling. "Henry asked me about the photograph," he said. She didn't turn from the stove. "I know." "You told him there was one?" "I asked if there was one. He told me he thought there was, but didn't know where." A pause. "It was in a box in my room," he said. "I found it this afternoon." Another pause, longer. "We sat together and looked at it. Him and Thomas both." She turned the heat down on the beans. She still didn't turn around. "He got the nose right in the drawing," Silas said. "He showed me the drawing. He'd gotten it nearly right just from memory." "He has a good eye," she said. "He has her eye," Silas said. "I hadn't—" He stopped. She heard him shift his weight. "I hadn't let myself see that before. How much of her is still here in those boys?" She was quiet for a moment, her hand on the pot handle. "She left good things," she said carefully. "She did," he said. His voice had the roughness in it that she'd come to recognize as the texture of something real, not performed. "I need to— I've been letting them forget. I didn't mean to. I just didn't know how to—" "Silas," she said gently, "you know how now. That's enough." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you," and went back to his room, and she heard the low murmur of his voice from that direction a while later, and Henry's voice, and once Thomas's voice at a different register, and she stood at the stove and cooked supper and let the sounds of that conversation fill the house without her in it, which was exactly right. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Something had cracked open in Silas. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way of a man who has found a door he'd locked years ago and has started, slowly, opening it. He talked about Clara more, in small amounts, in the way that people begin to talk about the dead once they've accepted that the talking doesn't erase the having lost. He said things at supper that connected the boys to their mother. Claire couldn't stand the smell of onions cooking either. "Henry, you got that from her." And each time one of those small things dropped into the dinner conversation, she watched the boys receive it the way dry ground receives water, immediately, completely, without any overflow. She watched all of this and felt something she chose not to name. She was becoming, she understood, essential in a way that was different from useful. Useful was easily replicated. Essential was harder to be honest about. She was the still point around which the household had begun to reorganize itself, and she was aware of it. And she was aware that Silas was becoming aware of it too, in the particular way of a man who keeps noticing something and hasn't yet decided what to do with the noticing. He looked at her differently than he had in November. She caught it sometimes from the side, when he didn't think she was paying attention, a quality of attention that was not the assessing, careful look of early days, not the practical acknowledgement of a man evaluating the utility of an arrangement, but something more personal and less armored. She caught it and looked away every time, because looking at it directly felt like touching a fence wire that might still be live. The evening of the 3rd week of May began ordinarily enough. It was a Tuesday, mild and clear, the kind of spring evening that made the Wyoming landscape look like a reward for surviving winter. She'd made a proper supper, roasted chicken, which was a relative luxury, and early greens she'd gotten from Ruth Calloway's garden because Ruth had more than she could use, and had sent Henry home with a bundle tied in brown paper. The table was set with the lamp lit early, and all four of them were at it, and the meal had that particular easy rhythm it had developed over months. The boys talking over each other about their day, Silas listening with the solid, attentive quality that was his version of engagement, Evelyn moving between the kitchen and the table and back. She had just sat down with her own plate when Henry, who had been eating with the focused intensity he brought to food he liked, looked up with complete unpredictability and said, "Are you and Papa ever going to get married?" The table went quiet. Not the charged quiet of embarrassment, not the careful quiet of a question that has been anticipated and prepared for. The sudden, absolute quiet of something that nobody had seen coming from any direction. Thomas's fork stopped moving. Silas went very still in the way he went still when something landed on him that he needed a moment to carry. Evelyn looked at her plate and made herself breathe at a normal rate. Henry, unaware or unconcerned that he had just dropped something into the middle of the table that the other three people were going to be dealing with for some time, looked between them with the serene curiosity of a child who has asked an entirely reasonable question and is waiting for the equally reasonable answer. "Because Ruth Calloway's daughter got married in April," he continued helpfully, "and she said it was because her father was lonely and her mother was steady and good. And Papa's lonely and Evelyn's steady and good, so I thought maybe—" "Henry," Thomas said. Henry looked at his brother. "What?" "Eat your chicken," Thomas said. Henry looked back at Evelyn, then at his father. Then, with the particular social antennae of a child who has just realized the room has changed temperature without understanding why, he went back to his chicken. Evelyn picked up her fork. She did not look at Silas. She was aware of him with the entire right side of her body, the way you are aware of something very still and very large in your peripheral vision. "Good chicken," Thomas said, with the voice of someone throwing a rope into a well. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "The greens are good too," Thomas added. "Ruth Calloway's garden," she said. "Nice of her," Thomas said. They ate. The lamp burned. Outside, the evening was going gold in the way that only happened in spring when the light was long. Nobody said anything else that mattered for the rest of the meal, and Henry, for once, seemed to understand that this was correct, and ate his supper with unusual quietness. When the meal was finished and she was clearing the table, Silas said, "Boys, go do the evening check on the barn." Thomas understood immediately. Henry started to protest that he'd already been to the barn twice today, registered Thomas's expression, and stopped protesting. The door closed behind them. She was at the basin with her back to the room. She heard the chair move, not push back from the table, just shifted, the particular sound of a man redistributing his weight as he rearranged something in himself. She kept her hands in the basin. "Evelyn." "You don't have to," she said. "Henry asks things without knowing what he's asking. It doesn't require—" "Henry asks exactly what he means," Silas said. "He just doesn't know yet that the rest of us have spent months not saying it." She went still. She heard him stand up from the table. She heard his boots on the floorboards, not coming to the basin, stopping somewhere in the middle of the kitchen, which took more nerve than coming all the way, because it committed to the conversation without the safety of having reached a destination. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything back. Because if you interrupt me, I'm going to lose the thread of it." She turned around. She leaned against the basin with her hands wet at her sides and looked at him across the kitchen. He was standing with his weight on both feet and his hands loose at his sides in the particular posture of a man who has chosen not to fold his arms, because folding his arms would be a retreat, and he was done retreating. He looked, she thought, terrified. She had never seen that on him before. He was one of the least terrified-looking men she'd encountered in the ordinary course of things. He moved through hard weather and hard work and hard loss with the steady forward motion of someone who had decided that fear was beside the point. But he was standing in his kitchen in the spring evening light, looking at her like a man standing at the edge of something with no idea what was on the other side. "When Clara died," he said, "I decided that the only thing I could afford to do was keep moving. Work the ranch, raise the boys, maintain the operation. That was it. That was the whole of it. Not because I was strong, because I didn't know any other option." He paused. "I hired you because I needed someone to keep house. That's the honest truth. I wasn't looking for anything else. I wouldn't have known how to look for anything else. She waited. I didn't notice when it changed, he said. I don't know how to give you the exact moment because there wasn't one. It was every day I came in from the fields and you were here, and the kitchen was warm and the boys were better, and the house was... He stopped. It was a house again, he said, not just a place I was maintaining. And I kept coming in and thinking, this is the best part, coming home. That's the best part of the whole day. She could hear her own heartbeat. That seemed wrong. She focused on keeping her face still. I didn't let myself understand what that meant, he said, because understanding it meant risking something I'd told myself I wasn't going to risk again. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. But Henry's 8 years old and he figured it out and said it at the dinner table, and I think that means I've been a coward about it long enough. The kitchen was very quiet. I can't offer you anything impressive, he said. I have a working ranch with a leaking barn roof and a fence line that Anders and Thomas are holding together with effort and wire, and 2 boys who need things I'm still learning how to give them, and more hard winters ahead, I know that. He breathed in. But I'm asking you to stay, not as the housekeeper. I'm asking you to stay as... He ran out of words for a moment. He pushed through. As my wife. If you want that. If you could want that. The last part came out less steady than the rest. She heard the crack in it. She had prepared herself for various futures. She was a practical woman, and practical women prepared themselves. She had prepared herself for leaving when the arrangement concluded, for finding another position, for the reasonable sadness of that, and the reasonable recovery from it. She had prepared herself for staying indefinitely in the careful ambiguity of what they'd had. She had not, she realized, genuinely prepared herself for this. For him standing in the kitchen looking terrified and asking her to stay as something that wasn't temporary or ambiguous at all. She crossed the kitchen. Not quickly. She walked the same way she did everything, with the deliberate steadiness that was her nature. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him, and he was watching her with the expression of a man who has said the thing and is now entirely at the mercy of what comes next. I'm not easy to live with, she said. He blinked. I know that. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong. I've noticed, he said. I'm going to keep putting Henry's drawings on the walls. I was hoping you would, he said, and the terrified look had shifted now, just slightly, the way ice shifts when the thaw begins underneath it before anything shows on the surface. Then, yes, she said. All right. He looked at her. Yes? Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He let out a breath that she suspected he'd been holding since before supper. She watched something go out of his shoulders, not weakness, but the specific tension of a man who has been braced for impact and has discovered there is none. He put his hand up and touched her face, briefly, carefully, the way you touch something you're not sure yet you're allowed to touch. His hand was rough and warm, and she stood very still. All right, he said. It came out quieter than she expected, more like a man talking to himself than to her, the sound of someone marking a moment, setting it down somewhere he could find it again. She heard the barn door, small footsteps and larger ones coming across the yard. She stepped back from him because some things didn't need an audience and turned to the basin to finish the dishes. Behind her, she heard him sit back down at the table, and she heard the quality of his sitting, different from all the months of evenings before it, the sound of a man who had put something down. The boys came in. Henry went directly to the table and climbed into his chair and looked at his father and then at Evelyn's back with the bright investigative attention of a child waiting to read the room. Thomas came in behind him and also looked, and his eyes were quicker and older and read it faster. Thomas looked at his plate. She saw the corner of his mouth move. You want some pie? She said, to nobody in particular. I made one this afternoon. Yes, said Henry immediately. What kind? Dried apple, she said. Same as always. I like that kind, he said. I know you do, she said. She cut the pie and brought it to the table and sat down in her chair. The fourth chair, her chair now in some way it hadn't been before tonight. And they ate together in the spring evening while the light outside went from gold to purple to the particular deep blue that came just before dark. Henry ate his pie with complete contentment, apparently satisfied that the universe had arranged itself correctly. Thomas ate his more quietly, with the occasional careful glance at his father and then at Evelyn that contained more than she could translate in a single reading. Silas ate his and drank his coffee and said very little, but the quality of his silence had changed so completely that it barely resembled the silence she'd first encountered in November. Later that night, after the boys were in bed, she stood at the east window in her room and looked at the Wyoming sky doing its extravagant spring thing with the stars, and she thought, I am not going to have to leave. She held that for a moment. Then she thought about everything she'd need to do tomorrow and the day after, all the practical, ordinary, continuing work of a household and a ranch and a family that was still growing into itself, and she felt, underneath all of it, the quiet particular weight of something that had been decided, something that was going to hold. She thought about the fourth chair. She thought she understood it better now. The morning after, nothing looked different and everything was. She noticed it in the small things first, the way she moved through the kitchen without the particular restraint she'd kept on herself for months, the way she looked at the house and thought, this is mine, without immediately correcting the thought back to something more careful. Nothing had changed in the walls or the furniture or the view from the east window. The fourth chair was still the fourth chair. The shutter on the left window still hung at its long-standing angle, but the lens she looked through had shifted, and the world on the other side of it looked different for it. Silas came down before light, the way he always did. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her at the stove, and they looked at each other for a moment in the early dark. Just a moment, nothing dramatic. And then he came in and poured his coffee, and she went back to the biscuits, and that was all, and it was enough. Henry came down and immediately asked if they could have eggs. We have 3, she said. That's 1 each, he said, doing the arithmetic with satisfaction. That's 1 each for you and Thomas. Your father and I can share. Henry appeared to find this perfectly natural. He took a seat and watched her with the benevolent attention of someone whose plans have come together correctly. She did not encourage this. She cracked the eggs. Thomas came down last, still pulling his suspender up over one shoulder, and stopped in the kitchen with the slightly elevated alertness of someone who had spent the night half expecting the atmosphere to be different and was now calibrating how different it actually was. He looked at his father. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at his brother, who was already eating his biscuit with complete serenity. Morning, Thomas said to nobody and everybody. Morning, Silas said from behind his coffee. Thomas sat down. He ate for a while in silence, the particular silence of a 12-year-old processing something significant without enough framework to process it cleanly. She put the eggs on the table. He took his portion with a nod. Halfway through breakfast, without looking up from his plate, he said, Are you going to tell us something, or just let Henry feel smug about it indefinitely? Henry looked up. I'm not smug, he said. You've got that look, Thomas said. What look? The one you get when you think you caused something good. Henry considered this with genuine seriousness. I did cause something good, he said, in the tone of a man stating a financial fact. Silas set his coffee cup down. He looked at his sons. He was not a man who made speeches, and he didn't make one now. He said, plainly and directly, Evelyn's agreed to marry me. I'd like to know if you boys have any objection to that. The question was real. That was what made it land the way it did. He wasn't telling them. He was asking, with the full seriousness of a man who understood that these 2 people at the table had a stake in the answer. Thomas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him steadily and let him take his time. He had a lot in his face right then. She could read most of it, the complicated arithmetic of a boy who had learned to love something and then lost it, who had spent 4 years convinced that allowing that particular vulnerability again was not worth the cost. It was all moving in him at once, and she didn't rush it and didn't look away. No objection, he said finally, quietly. Then after a beat so small she nearly missed it. I'm glad. She heard the full weight of what it cost him to say that, and she did not make anything of it out loud, because that was the only right response to courage, to receive it without spectacle. Henry, for his part, had already gone back to his egg. I knew, he said, to the table, to no one in particular, with the profound satisfaction of the very young. Thomas looked at his brother. You didn't know, you guessed. I knew, Henry said serenely. There's a difference. Thomas, Silas said. Thomas stopped. He picked up his fork. He was working on not smiling, and he was losing. She went back to the stove and gave herself a moment with her back to the room, because some things don't need a witness. The news reached Harlow before the week was out, which was Wyoming and therefore inevitable. Ruth Calloway appeared at the ranch on a Thursday morning with a basket over her arm and the expression of a woman who has heard something and has decided that showing up in person is the correct response. Evelyn saw her coming from the kitchen window and had coffee ready by the time Ruth knocked. Ruth came in, set the basket on the table. It contained a jar of her preserves and what turned out to be a length of good blue wool fabric, and looked at Evelyn with the direct appraising warmth she'd shown in town back in February. "Is it true?" she said. "It's true," Evelyn said. Ruth sat down. She looked at the kitchen, the drawings above the window, the organized pantry visible through the open door, the ledger on the shelf where it lived now, the general atmosphere of a house that had been lived in rather than merely maintained. "Good," she said firmly, as though settling a debate. Evelyn poured the coffee. "You could at least pretend to be surprised." "I'm not built for pretending," Ruth said. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I told Margaret Greer in December that it would happen before summer. She bet against me." She looked satisfied. "She owes me a jar of her blackberry preserves." "You were wagering on my personal life in December?" "Small towns," Ruth said, without apology. "It's that, or talk about the weather." She looked at the fabric in the basket. "That's for a dress. If you want one. You don't have to, but I thought, a woman should have something good to wear for her own wedding, and that color is right for you." Evelyn looked at the wool. It was a particular shade of blue, not showy, not trying hard, just good and true. She reached out and touched it. Excellent weight. Someone who knew fabric had chosen it. "This is too much," she said. "It's not," Ruth said. "You've done more for those boys in 6 months than—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You've done well by this family. Accept the fabric." Evelyn accepted the fabric. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour, which stretched to an hour and a half, and Ruth talked about the town, and Evelyn listened and eventually started talking back, which was different from how their first 2 meetings had gone. Ruth had the quality that Evelyn valued in people. She said what she meant and didn't ornament it. She talked about her own husband without flinching, about the 3 years since he died, about the specific loneliness of knowing exactly what you were missing because you'd had it. She talked about her daughter and the April wedding and what it had meant to see that particular shape of happiness again in the people around her. "Silas is not an easy man," Ruth said, at some point that had the quality of something she'd been working toward. Not a warning, exactly. More like something she wanted on the table. "I know," Evelyn said. "He goes quiet for stretches. Not moody, just interior. Clara knew how to handle it. She'd leave him a cup of coffee somewhere visible and go do something else. He'd come back." Ruth turned her cup. "I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm telling you it's a thing." "I've noticed," Evelyn said. "I've been doing the coffee." Ruth looked at her. Something in her expression shifted into genuine warmth, the kind that didn't happen on a surface. "All right," she said. "You're going to be fine." The wedding was a Saturday in early June. They'd talked about it once, directly, about a week after the proposal. She'd brought it up because it needed to be brought up, and he'd confirmed that he had no strong preferences about the form of it as long as it happened, which was both very Silas and entirely sufficient. She'd organized the rest without ceremony, the circuit judge who came through Harlow every 6 weeks, a date that aligned, 2 witnesses. Ruth Calloway was 1 witness. Anders, who accepted the role with a single nod and no further comment, was the other. She made the blue dress herself in the evenings over the 2 weeks before. It wasn't elaborate. The wool didn't call for elaborate, and neither did she. But it fit well, and the color was right, as Ruth had said. Thomas, who had discovered an interest in the proceedings that he expressed by hovering near whatever room the planning was happening in and contributing opinions when directly asked, told her that the color was good. She thanked him. Henry told her she looked like a painting. She told him that was a fine thing to say, and he agreed with himself thoroughly. The morning of the wedding, she was in the kitchen at 5 because she couldn't sleep past 5, and she was at the stove with her coffee when she heard Silas's door and then his footsteps, and then him stopping in the kitchen doorway the same way he had every morning for months. She looked at him. He was dressed already in his good shirt and the dark coat he wore to town. He'd combed his hair, which always looked slightly surprised by the effort. He looked like himself wearing his best version of himself, which was exactly right. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said. He came in and poured his coffee and leaned against the counter beside her rather than sitting at the table, which was a small difference she noticed. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "Just checking." "Are you?" he said. "No," she said. He drank his coffee. They stood side by side at the kitchen counter in the early morning, the house still quiet above them, the June morning coming pale and clear through the east window. And she thought that this was probably as good as it got. This specific ordinary thing, standing beside someone in your own kitchen in the early dark, both of you exactly where you'd chosen to be. The ceremony was at noon in Harlow, in the parlor of the judge's temporary office above the feed store, which smelled like sawdust and old paper and not at all like romance, which suited them both. The judge was a compact, efficient man named Hartley, who had done this enough times to know how to read the room, and the room said, "Keep it honest and don't make it long." He kept it honest and didn't make it long. Silas said the words looking directly at her, which cost him something. He was not a man who found direct exposure comfortable. And she said them looking back at him, and both of them said them like they meant every word separately, not just the shape of them together. Anders stood against the wall with his hat in his hands, looking like a man enduring something pleasant with difficulty. Ruth stood on the other side, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while simultaneously looking like someone who would deny doing so if asked. The boys were in the front, Thomas in his good shirt, Henry in his, with the collar already crooked by noon. Henry watched the proceedings with the rapt attention he gave to things he considered important. Thomas watched with the careful, contained expression of someone who is feeling something larger than he has a framework for yet, and holding it together through sheer composure. When it was done, when the judge closed his book, and Ruth actually laughed out loud at something Anders muttered, and Henry immediately asked if there was going to be cake. Silas reached over and took her hand, not with any drama, not with any announcement, just took it and held it. His hand was large and rough and warm, the same hand that had held still on the kitchen table while she stitched his arm, the same hand she'd watched touch Clara's bridle with such careful grief. She held it back. They had supper that evening at Ruth's, which Ruth had organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything. There was a proper meal, and Ruth's blackberry preserves opened ceremonially on the table, and Anders ate 3 helpings of everything and said almost nothing and seemed genuinely content. The boys were at the table on their best behavior, which for Henry meant enthusiastic participation, and for Thomas meant a sustained effort at dignity, occasionally broken by Henry saying something that made him laugh. At one point, Thomas said, addressing the general table, "Anders, did you know that Evelyn grew up on a horse farm?" Anders looked at her. "She knows more about horses than Papa," Thomas said in the tone of someone sharing a discovery. "I know plenty about horses," Silas said. "She corrected you on Tuesday," Thomas said. "She had a point on Tuesday," Silas said. "She was right," Thomas said serenely. Silas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him with her face entirely composed. He shook his head and went back to his supper, and she heard Thomas's quiet exhale that meant he was pleased with himself. And across the table, Henry drew something on a scrap of paper he'd been carrying in his pocket all day and slid it across to her without comment. It was the 4 of them, at a table. Recognizable. Silas's broad shoulders, Thomas's watchful posture, Henry small and precise next to him, and herself, the 4th figure, at the 4th chair. She looked at it for a moment. "It's good," she said quietly. "You have kind eyes," Henry said, pointing at his rendering of her with one finger. "That's hard to draw. I've been practicing." She folded the drawing carefully and put it in her dress pocket. She carried it there all evening. The return to the ranch that night was quiet in the good way. The boys tired in the back of the wagon, Henry already half asleep against Thomas's shoulder, Thomas not objecting to this, the June night warm enough to ride without coats, the stars doing the extravagant Wyoming thing overhead. Silas drove. She sat beside him on the wagon board the way she'd sat beside him in February going to town and back, except that nothing was the same as it had been then, and both of them knew it. "Thomas is pleased," she said quietly, so the boys wouldn't hear. He is, Silas said. He drove for a moment. He told me something last week, while you were in town with Ruth. He paused, choosing the words carefully. He said that he wasn't afraid anymore, about people leaving. He kept his eyes on the road. He said you were the first person who felt like someone who was going to stay. She looked at the road ahead, at the way the darkness gathered along the edges where the land met the sky. I am, she said. I know, he said. He wasn't looking at her, but his shoulder was against hers in the narrow wagon seat, and she felt the full intentional weight of that contact. I know you are. They got back to the ranch and she got Henry inside and to bed while Silas and Thomas put up the horse. Henry didn't fully wake during any of this. He went from the wagon to his bed with the trust of a child who has learned that being carried somewhere safe is a reliable expectation. She pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway of his room for a moment in the dark. Thomas came upstairs and stopped in the hallway. He was doing the thing he did where he was present without fully committing to a moment until he'd decided whether it deserved his full presence. Thank you, he said, for today. She looked at him. Your father asked me to marry him, she said. The thank you goes to him. You could have said no, Thomas said. She held the doorframe. I could have. He stood in the hallway for another moment, 12 years old, already carrying himself like someone older, already more complicated than most adults she'd known. He had his mother's tooling in him somewhere, the patience, the eye for detail, the willingness to spend time getting something exactly right. I'm glad you didn't, he said. He went to his room. She stood in the hallway for a moment after his door closed, in the quiet, dark house, listening to the particular silence of a house full of sleeping people, a silence that was full rather than empty, inhabited, alive with the sounds of people at rest rather than people gone. She went downstairs. Silas was at the kitchen table with his coffee, which was where she found him most evenings. The lamp was low. The kitchen had its nighttime smell, the cooling stove, the pine floor, something faintly like the bread she'd baked that morning. She sat down across from him. Thomas said thank you, she said. He told me something last week. I know, she said. You just told me. He looked at her, the lamp between them. Right. She reached across the table and moved the ledger 2 inches to the right for no reason at all, and then moved it back. He watched her do this with the patient attention of a man who had accepted that the woman across from him was going to do things he didn't fully understand, and that this was fine. The shutter on the left window, she said. I know. It should have been fixed. In November, he said. I know. It's been 9 months, she said. I've been busy, he said. You have a working ranch, she said. You'll always be busy. That's probably true, he said. So fix the shutter, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp burned between them, and outside the Wyoming night was doing its quiet, enormous thing. And somewhere upstairs 2 boys were asleep in the particular way of children who have decided, finally, that the ground beneath them is solid. He almost smiled. I'll fix the shutter, he said. Tomorrow, she said. She picked up his empty coffee cup and went to the stove to refill it, and she heard him shift in his chair, and not restlessly, but with the unhurried weight of a man who has nowhere better to be, who has decided that here, in this kitchen, on this night, is exactly the right place. She filled the cup and brought it back and set it down in front of him, and he looked up at her with an expression she had learned to read now, the one that said more than he was going to put into words. She sat back down. She opened the ledger and pulled it toward her because there were accounts to review and the week didn't stop for weddings. He picked up his coffee. She found her place in the columns. The lamp was good. The house was quiet and full. The 4th chair was no longer a question. It was simply where she sat. He fixed the shutter the next morning. She heard him out there before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. The particular sounds of a man on a ladder, the hammer finding the right angle, the small grunt of effort when the bracket finally seated correctly. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the shutter settle flush against the house for the first time since she'd arrived. And she thought about all the things that get left undone. Not because people don't care, but because caring requires a kind of energy that grief depletes completely, and how the return of that energy is so gradual you don't notice it until one morning someone is on a ladder fixing a shutter they've walked past for years. She poured a second cup and left it on the porch rail where he'd find it when he came down. She went back inside. She heard him find it. That was the summer of 1887, the first real summer of the thing they were building, and it was not seamless. She had never believed in seamless. The ranch had its hard weeks and its harder ones. A section of the herd got into the north pasture through a gap in the fence and took 2 days to fully account for, and Silas came in from those 2 days worn to the bone and short-tempered in the specific way of exhausted men, the kind where everything anyone said was slightly wrong. She gave him his supper and his coffee and his space, and when he snapped at her over something small on the second evening, she said, "I know you're tired. That's still not all right," and went back to the stove. And he sat with that for a moment and then said, "You're right. I'm sorry," which she had learned was not easy for him and accepted accordingly. Thomas, at 13, was developing a personality that was recognizably his own in ways that were sometimes inconvenient. He had opinions about the ranch's operation, not wrong opinions, which was the challenge, and he'd begun expressing them in a manner that occasionally bordered on argumentative. Silas handled this with the patience of a man who recognized himself in the behavior and wasn't entirely sure whether to be alarmed or gratified. She handled it by listening to Thomas's arguments on their merits and telling him directly when he was right and when he needed more information before he had an opinion worth expressing. "You told him he was wrong," Silas said one evening after she'd corrected Thomas's assessment of the south pasture drainage situation at supper. "He was wrong," she said. "He doesn't take that easily." "He took it fine," she said. "He argued for another 30 seconds, and then he thought about it, and he stopped arguing. That's not bad." Silas looked at her. "He doesn't stop arguing with me that fast." "That's because when you two argue, it's about something other than the argument," she said. "You both know it. It takes longer to find the way back." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a precise thing to say." "It's a true thing," she said. He didn't disagree. The first real test came in September. She was pregnant by then. She'd known since August, had told Silas in the practical, direct manner that she brought to important news, and he had received it with the specific quality of stillness that meant he was feeling something too large to immediately navigate. He'd put his hand on her face the same way he had the night she'd agreed to marry him, briefly, carefully, and said, "All right," in the voice he used when something mattered too much for more words. Henry had been told and had immediately drawn a picture of the baby, which was optimistic given that no one had any information yet, and which she put up beside the others above the kitchen window. Thomas had been told and had gone very quiet for a long time and then said, "Are you going to be all right?" And she'd understood that the question carried more than its surface, that he was asking about all of it, about her, about the family, about the precarious thing they'd built, and whether it could hold more weight. "Yes," she told him. "Are you?" He thought about it seriously. "I think so," he said. "I just need to get used to it." "That's fair," she said. The September test was not the pregnancy. It was a woman named Dorothy Hale. Dorothy Hale arrived in Harlow from back east, recently widowed, visiting her sister who had married a local rancher 3 years prior. She was handsome, well-spoken, and had the polished quality of someone from a different kind of life, and she came to the ranch twice in the first week she was in town, once with her sister, ostensibly a social call, and once alone, on the thinnest of pretexts involving a question about cattle grazing rights that any person with actual interest in cattle grazing rights would have asked someone else. Evelyn was not a jealous woman by nature. She'd never had enough to be jealous over to develop the habit, but she was observant, and she observed Dorothy Hale looking at Silas with the intent appraisal of a woman making calculations. And she observed Silas being politely, somewhat stiffly, civil in the way he was civil to things he was uncertain about, which she also observed and filed carefully. Silas's eyes did not follow Dorothy Hale when she moved. They came back every time to wherever Evelyn was standing. The second visit, Dorothy stayed for coffee, invited by Thomas, who had no idea what he was navigating, and who she forgave entirely because he was 13 and the situation was invisible to him. She sat at the kitchen table with the composed elegance of a woman who knew how she looked in someone else's kitchen. And she was pleasant to Evelyn in the way that contained a question. Evelyn answered the question by being entirely herself. Not cold, not performing, not staking any territory in any visible way. She poured the coffee and sat down in her chair and was present in the specific way of someone who lives somewhere, who knows where everything is and how everything runs, who is so embedded in a place that the place would visibly be wrong without her. Dorothy Hale left after an hour and didn't come back. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Silas said, "She was interested in me." "I know," Evelyn said. "You weren't—" He paused. "You seemed fine." "I was fine," she said. "You weren't interested in her." He looked at her. "No." "Then there was nothing to worry about," she said. He turned his cup in his hands. "Most women would have—" "I'm not most women," she said. "I wasn't going to make a scene over something that only existed in one direction." She looked at him steadily. "But if I'd been wrong about the direction, I would have said something." "You weren't wrong," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to the ledger. She heard him, from behind her, let out a breath that had the particular quality of a man who has just understood something about the person he married. She didn't turn around. Some things were better received privately. The baby came in March of 1888, which was inconvenient timing in the way that babies are often inconvenient. The calving season was running early, and Silas was stretched thin and the weather had not cooperated with anyone's plans. Ruth Calloway arrived the day before and stayed, which was not something Evelyn had asked for, and was exactly what she needed. And Ruth managed the situation with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this enough times to know that calm efficiency was the only useful response. Silas spent 11 hours in the state of suspended, barely controlled anxiety that men occupy when something large is happening that they cannot work or fix their way through. Thomas sat with him for part of it. Henry drew. At some point in the middle of the night, Thomas went to the kitchen and made coffee. She heard it from the bedroom, the sounds of her oldest stepson doing the things she'd taught him in the same kitchen where she'd once sat with him and watched him drink coffee for the first time, and she thought, between the harder parts of what she was currently dealing with, that there are things you give people that you don't know you're giving them until you see them use it years later. The baby was a girl. She came into the world with strong opinions about the process and announced them clearly, which Ruth said was a good sign, and which Silas, when they finally let him in, received with an expression she had never seen on him before and didn't have a name for. Something unguarded and enormous, something that had no armor in it at all. He held the baby with the careful, slightly terrified competence of a man who had done this before and hadn't forgotten the weight of it. She watched him from the pillow, exhausted down to her bones, and watched him look at his daughter, and she thought, there it is. There's the man that was inside the sealed-up one all along. Henry named her Lily, which he announced with the authority of someone who had thought about it in advance and arrived prepared. Thomas said it was a good name. Silas said that Evelyn should decide. Evelyn said Lily was right and thanked Henry for the service. Henry looked pleased in the particular way of people who have contributed something lasting. The drawing he made that week, Lily's face, small and furious and new, went up above the kitchen window with the others. By now there were 14 of Henry's drawings above that window, a running record of the family's life in the particular visual grammar of a boy who saw things and made them permanent. People who came to the kitchen invariably stopped and looked at them. Ruth had once stood in front of them for a full 2 minutes without speaking. "He has real ability," she said, finally. "I know," Evelyn said. "Does he know?" "He's starting to," she said. Henry was 9 now. He had the same string-around-the-fingers habit, the same sideways approach to things that mattered, the same uncanny accuracy of observation. But something had opened in him that hadn't been there when she'd arrived, a confidence in his own seeing, a willingness to take up space with what he noticed. She thought about the boy who had told her his mother used to be really funny, who had worried about forgetting her face, who had sat in the barn's south window trying to reconstruct from memory what was already beginning to fade. He hadn't forgotten. The drawing was there. The bridle was still on the tack wall. Clara's apple butter story was in the family's vocabulary now, the kind of story that gets told the way families tell things, slightly different each time, accumulating small inaccuracies that become their own truth. This was what she had understood eventually about the fourth chair. It had never been about replacement. It had never been about filling a space that belonged to someone else. Clara belonged to this family in her own permanent way, and nothing Evelyn was or did change that or was meant to. The fourth chair had been about addition, about a family that had contracted around its grief, adding someone back, opening the table, making room. She thought about this often in the years that followed, when people in town would say something well-meaning but imprecise about her having given those boys a mother, as though Thomas and Henry had been without one. They'd had a mother. Clara had been their mother. What they'd had, after losing her, was a family that had forgotten how to be one, and what Evelyn had done, what she'd been quietly, stubbornly doing since that first November morning, was refuse to let them stay forgotten. The distinction mattered to her. It probably didn't matter to most people. It mattered to her. Thomas understood it. He was the one who'd lived on both sides of the line, old enough when Clara died to remember, old enough when Evelyn arrived to have already built his defenses. He was also the one who, at 15, said something to her that she thought about for a long time afterward. They'd been in the barn, both of them, she checking on a mare that had been off her feed, and Thomas helping without being asked, which was how Thomas helped. He appeared and was useful before you'd realized you needed him. They'd been working in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over the years, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "Did you know, when you came here, that it would turn out like this?" She considered the question seriously because he'd asked it seriously. "No," she said. "I knew the terms, wages, meals, work. I thought I was coming to do a job." "When did you know it was something else?" She turned it over. "I'm not sure there was a specific moment," she said. "It was more like I stopped being able to imagine leaving and not caring. That happened slowly." He was quiet for a moment, his hands moving over the mare's flank in a steady, familiar pattern. "I was terrible to you at the beginning," he said. "You were 12 and you'd been hurt," she said. "You weren't terrible. You were defended." "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate one," she said. She looked at him. He was 15 now, nearly as tall as Silas, with the beginning of the same broad-shouldered build. He had Clara in his coloring and something of Silas in his bone structure and something entirely his own in the way he held himself. "You let me in eventually. That's what I remember." He looked at his hands. "You didn't stop," he said. "You just kept being there, being useful. You didn't make it into a big thing when I wasn't ready for a big thing." He paused. "Most people make it a big thing when they want you to trust them." "Most people want the credit before they've done the work," she said. He half smiled. "Papa says you're the most patient, impatient person he's ever met." "What does that mean?" "He says you know exactly what you want, and you'll wait forever for it, but you've never once been patient about a thing that didn't need to be waited for." He glanced at her. "He means it as a compliment." "It sounds like a compliment," she said. "It is," Thomas said. "From him, that's a long compliment." She went back to the mare. Outside, the afternoon was doing something golden with the light the way Wyoming afternoons did in autumn, stretching it out long and warm before it went. She could hear Henry somewhere in the yard, his voice carrying the particular bright energy he had when he was outside with room to move in. She could hear the distant sounds of Silas working along the fence line, the horse, the occasional ring of metal. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah, you're going to be a good man," she said. "Not because of anything I did, because of what you decided to do with what you had." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't look at him. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No decoration. She nodded. They went back to work. The years stacked up the way years do, not in a line but in layers, each one changing the shape of what was below it. Lily grew into a person of specific, sometimes exhausting, opinions, which Henry found delightful, and Thomas found familiar, and Silas handled with the particular mixture of bafflement and pride that fathers bring to daughters who turn out to be themselves. 2 more children came, a boy they called James, and another girl, May, who arrived in a winter storm in 1892 that kept the midwife from making it in time and therefore cemented Anders' unexpected legacy as the most stoic emergency midwife in Larimer County, a title he refused to discuss under any circumstances. The kitchen table got a leaf added in 1891, then another in 1893. The drawings above the window had to be rotated because there were too many to display at once, and Evelyn developed a system for this that Henry, by then 17, talking about going east for proper training, found both touching and slightly absurd. "You've got 43 of them up there in rotation," he told her. 47, she said. "You counted." "You made them," she said. "Of course I counted." He looked at her with the expression she'd known since he was 8 years old, the one that started sideways and came around to direct. "Will you keep them up when I'm gone?" "Henry," she said, "I put your first drawing up in November of 1886. It hasn't come down since." She looked at the wall. "They'll be up until the house falls down, and probably the house will fall down around them." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him the way his best laughs always were. She'd been making him laugh like that for 8 years, and it still felt like something earned. The conversation she had with Silas about the fourth chair happened, of all times, on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1893, when James was 2 and May was a year old, and both of them were finally, improbably, asleep at the same time, and the house had the temporary, breathable quality of a ship in the eye of a storm. She'd been looking at the chair, the original fourth chair, now somewhat battered, one leg repaired twice, the seat worn to a shine in the particular place she'd sat for years. It had been moved and repositioned many times as the table grew. There were more chairs now, obviously. The chair was not special in any visible way, but she'd always known which one it was. Silas came in from checking on the horses and found her standing at the edge of the kitchen looking at it. "What?" he said, reading her the way he'd gotten good at over the years. "I was thinking about the chair," she said. He looked at it. He knew the one she meant without her specifying. He'd known about it for a long time. She'd told him, one evening when enough time had passed to make it into something they could hold together rather than something only she carried. He'd listened, and then he'd said, in the characteristic Silas way, "I bought it at the auction in October of 85. I don't know why I got 4. We were 3. And then he'd been quiet for a while and said, I suppose I knew something I hadn't told myself yet. Now he stood beside her and looked at the chair, worn and ordinary and irreplaceable. "Henry's leaving in March," she said. "I know. Thomas is talking about his own spread by the time he's 20. "He'll be ready," Silas said. "Earlier, probably. The house is going to get louder before it gets quieter," she said. "Lily's got 3 more years of this volume left in her at minimum." "At minimum," he agreed with the weariness and tenderness of a father of a 10-year-old girl. She looked at the chair. "I used to think about leaving," she said, "that first winter, when I'd remind myself what the arrangement was, that I was employed here, that I didn't have a claim on any of it." He was quiet beside her. "I used to make myself remember that every night," she said. "Some nights it was the only thing that kept me sensible." "What changed?" he said. She looked at him. 7 years of his face, 7 years of learning what the different qualities of his silence meant, and the different registers of his voice, and the way he held himself when he was carrying something and when he'd put it down. 7 years of the east window and the morning light and the accounts and the biscuits on Monday and Thursday and the coffee always in a reliable state. "Henry brought me a drawing," she said, "of a horse, and you were trying not to show that the biscuits were better than you expected. And Thomas drank coffee for the first time and pretended he'd had it before." She paused. "I stopped being able to imagine leaving and it not mattering. After that, every day made it worse." He put his arm around her, not with any particular ceremony, just the ordinary comfort of a man who has gotten used to being close to someone and doesn't see a reason not to be. She leaned against him slightly, which she also did without thinking anymore, because that was what 7 years did to the careful distances you used to keep. "I almost didn't advertise the position," he said. She looked up at him. "I'd placed 2 ads before, and neither of them— the women who came weren't wrong, they just weren't—" He searched for the word. "Steady," he said. "I'd about decided the boys and I would manage through another winter on our own." "What changed?" "Anders told me I was being a fool," he said. In those words. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. I'll thank him. He'll deny having said it, Silas said. I know, she said. I'll thank him anyway. They stood there in the kitchen that had become hers by the smallest increments, over the longest time, through the most ordinary means. And outside the Wyoming autumn was doing the thing it did when the air got cold enough to be honest, and somewhere in the house a child shifted in sleep and settled, and the lamp burned on the table between the ledger and the coffee pot, and the fourth chair sat where it always sat. She had learned something in 7 years that she'd not known how to name when she arrived. She'd known how to work. She'd known how to be useful. She'd known how to be practical and steady and competent, and all the other things that had gotten her through the years between Nebraska and Wyoming without falling apart. What she hadn't known, what she'd had to learn from a household full of grieving people who didn't know they were teaching her, was that steadiness isn't just about holding yourself together. It's about being willing to hold your ground in someone else's life until they remember how to hold their own. She hadn't set out to save anyone. She'd set out to keep a house. But houses, she'd found, were not separate from the people in them. And keeping one properly meant keeping the people too, which meant not looking away when they were struggling, and not making a performance of your presence, and not requiring gratitude before it was ready to be given, and not leaving when it was hard, and not leaving when it was easy. She thought about the woman in Nebraska who had grown up knowing 40 horses by name and learned to read a hard frost before it showed on the ground. She thought about the girl who'd lost her father and her home in the same season and learned to travel light. She thought about all the previous positions and all the careful distances she'd kept, and all the nights she'd laid in other east-facing windows, in other narrow rooms, telling herself she wasn't somewhere she was supposed to be. She'd been wrong. She'd just taken a long time to get to the right place. Henry left for the East in March of 1894, as planned. He came back for Christmas that year with a sketchbook full of things he'd seen and the particular shine of a young person who has discovered that the world is larger than they imagined and finds this wonderful rather than frightening. He sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn for 2 hours on his first evening home, showing her the drawings one by one, explaining each one with the fluency of someone who had found the language that fit his thoughts. And she looked at everyone carefully and asked real questions and told him when something was exceptional and when something needed more time. "You're harder on me than my teachers," he said. "Your teachers see you for a semester," she said. "I've seen 47 drawings. I know what you're capable of." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the wall above the kitchen window, where the current rotation included his first horse drawing from 1886, yellowed now at the edges, the lines still clean. "You kept the first one at the top," he said. "I always keep the first one at the top," she said. He looked at it for a long time. "I was 8, he said. "I was so afraid you wouldn't like it." "I know," she said. "I could tell." "Was it actually good?" he said. "Or were you just being kind?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It was good," she said. "It was genuinely good. I wasn't being kind. I was being accurate." He looked back at her. He was 18 years old and already becoming the person he was going to be, and she could see it. The eye, the patience, the sideways approach to things that mattered. Clara's eye, Henry's own patient heart, something she hoped she'd contributed, though she couldn't have said exactly what. "Thank you," he said. "For the wall." She reached across and moved his sketchbook 2 inches to the right for no reason, the same unconscious habit she'd had for years with the ledger. "Leave your new drawings when you go back," she said. "I'll rotate them in." He left them. She rotated them in. The wall kept growing. Thomas got his own spread at 19, a modest operation 2 miles east, close enough to be a neighbor and far enough to be his own man, which was exactly the right distance for both of them. He came for Sunday supper most weeks, came to the kitchen door, always, rather than the front, which was the door you used when you were visiting somewhere, and he was not visiting, he was coming home. He married at 22 a woman named Sarah from a family further north, who had the quality of someone who knew her own mind and didn't apologize for it, which Thomas had apparently decided was a requirement. Sarah and Evelyn found their footing with each other in the first year. It was not instant, and it was not uncomplicated, because 2 women who know their own minds occupying connected territories rarely makes for instant simplicity, and what they settled into was a respect that didn't require warmth to sustain it, The warmth developed over time anyway. The Sunday suppers got larger. The table got another leaf. Lily grew into a person who could argue any position effectively regardless of whether she held it, which Evelyn recognized as a specific kind of intelligence that needed direction or it would find its own, and she directed it accordingly, toward the books she'd brought and the conversations she'd learned to have, and the hard Wyoming work that taught Lily that intelligence without application was just noise. Lily at 12 told Evelyn she wanted to be a lawyer. Evelyn said that Wyoming would probably be ready for that before Lily was finished preparing for it. Lily took this as encouragement, which was exactly how it was meant. James grew up quieter than his sisters, more like Silas in his economy of expression, with a gift for the land itself, for reading what it needed, for understanding the cattle the way some people understand a language they never formally learned. By the time he was 10, Silas was showing him things rather than teaching him, because James already knew half of them and was figuring out the other half on his own. May, the youngest, was the family's comedian. She had the timing and the delivery and the complete lack of self-consciousness. And she had Clara's funny. Evelyn had never known Clara, but she knew it from Henry's description and from the way Silas sometimes laughed at May with a quality that was different from his other laughs. A little fuller, a little more surprised. She didn't say anything about it. She just let him have it. The ranch changed over the years, grew in some ways, contracted in others, weathered losses and recovered from them, and went on. There were bad years, a drought in '96 that took a hard toll, a fever that moved through the cattle in 1899 and cost them more than they could easily recover. There were good years that built back what the bad ones took. There was never a time that wasn't also work, also difficult, also asking more than was comfortable to give. That was the truth about the life she'd chosen, and she'd known it from the first morning she stepped off the wagon onto the half-frozen mud and looked at the ranch and made herself not react. It was not a comfortable life. It was a real one. She had found, over the years, that she preferred real to comfortable when she had to choose. Silas aged the way hard-working men age, gradually and then all at once, the lines in his face settling deeper, the hair going from dark to silver in a way that suited him. He remained who he was in all the ways that mattered, the economy of expression, the quality of attention, the steadiness that didn't perform itself. He remained hard to read to people who didn't know him and easy to read to people who did, which was its own kind of loyalty. He still brought his coffee to the table early in the morning. He still sat in the kitchen longer in the evenings than strictly necessary. He still said more in small things than in large statements. She had never needed him to be different from what he was, and he had never needed that from her, and that, she had come to understand, was not a small thing. That was in fact quite a large thing. That was perhaps the whole of it. On an evening in the autumn of 1899, 13 years after she'd stepped off a wagon with $12 and a cedar recipe box, she was at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the accounts in front of her. The house was loud. James and May arguing about something down the hall, Lily reading out loud to herself in the particular way she had of testing arguments, the distant sounds of Silas and Thomas talking on the porch. The kitchen smelled like the bread she'd baked that morning, and the coffee that had been a reliable presence on the stove for 13 years, and the faint wool and outdoors smell of a working family's house. Above the window in the current rotation, Henry's first horse from 1886, the drawing of the four of them at the table from the wedding night, a landscape of the mountain ridge from 1891, and a new one, a portrait of the whole family at the expanded table, done on Henry's last visit, everyone recognizable, everyone slightly idealized in the specific way of someone who loves the people he's drawing. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the fourth chair, worn to a shine in the exact place she'd been sitting for 13 years, repaired twice, entirely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know. She put her pen down. There was a thing she'd understood for some time, but had never tried to put into words, because words made things smaller than they were, and this was a thing she didn't want made smaller. But sitting in the autumn kitchen with the noise of the family filling the house around her, she tried to find it anyway. She had arrived here with nothing she considered permanent. She had left every other place without being certain anyone would remember she'd been there. She had traveled light and held herself carefully and reminded herself every night for years that she had no claim on anything she found herself starting to love. And then, one ordinary morning at a time, she had stopped being careful. Not because she'd stopped being practical, not because someone had given her permission or drawn her a map, but because the fourth chair was there and she was in it, and the family was real, and the love in it was real, and real things she had found did not require permission. They required only the willingness to stay. She picked up her pen. She went back to the accounts. Down the hall, the argument between James and May reached its resolution with the particular finality of younger siblings who have run out of steam. The porch voices went quiet as Silas and Thomas reached whatever conclusion they'd been working toward. The lamp burned on. The fourth chair held, the way it always had. Outside, Wyoming went on being itself, enormous and indifferent and full of hard weather and hard work and distances that made everything feel either very small or very real. She had arrived here not knowing which she was. She knew now she was real. They all were. And that, when you got down to it, was everything worth staying for.